With pleasure, I would like to read a short biography of our first speaker, Dr. Ghasem Bayat. Dr. Ghasem Bayat is a scientist, petroleum engineer, and an educator with a bachelor's in science and PhD in petroleum engineering. His work on petroleum reservoirs over the past 40 years around the world have allowed him to learn about many of the world's unique cultures and faiths. While serving in positions of technical leadership at several international corporations, he has found it possible to conduct his business dealings in a Baha'i spirit and an environmentally friendly manner. He has actively participated in the Baha'i radio and television programs over the past decade. For the past 4 years, he has been representing the Baha'i faith in a live interfaith dialogue on an international Persian TV program introducing the faith to the Persian-speaking world. He is currently the vice president of an independent oil and gas company in Houston. He has published many technical papers in engineering journals, as well as the Baha'i publications on various aspects of the Baha'i faith. Dr. Bayat has been married to Dr. Sateh Bayat for 37 years, and they live in Houston, Texas. And today, he will be talking about how the non-aggressive response of the Baha'is and the Baha'i faith to the Islamic Revolution have contributed to the awakening of the Iranian people's consciousness. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Ghasem Bayat.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a beautiful video to see, and certainly our world is a very beautiful place. But I can tell you, this site is more beautiful to watch from here. And thank you for that introduction. Dear friends, often this subject comes up, that all this suffering of Baha'is, martyrdom, and sacrifices they have done, what do we have for it? I would like to take you through a journey, and with the evidence of history of the European nations, and then focus on the Iranian nation, and show you that the sacrifices of the Persian Baha'is, as well as other groups in Iran, is achieving something which is unique in that part of the world, the awakening of their consciousness. The truth is that people go about life almost like half asleep. People do everything they do. It is as though they are in a deep slumber, not really being conscious of what's going on around them. And the subject is called being fascinated with whatever we do. A vain person in front of a mirror is doing exactly the same thing. Now, there seems to be this fascination, which is the problem. How often you're driving and then somebody just walks in front of your car as though this person is not conscious of anything. That's really what I'm talking about. And it takes an incredible force, incredible effort for people to wake up, their consciousness being awakened. So that's what we need, enlightenment. But in order to be awakened, in order to come out of this deep sleep, although physically we're walking around and nobody thinks that we are asleep, certainly ourselves aren't conscious of it. we need to know that we are asleep. I'm not a humorous person, but I like to tell you a real story joke, very short. My brother-in-law was visiting us in Scotland, in the city of Glasgow. And in the cold of Scotland, it's pretty common for people to drink a lot. And if first thing in the morning you walk in the streets, you come across a lot of them. My brother-in-law was coming to visit us. This is Dr. Fananopazir, Lame Fananopazir. Anyway, he told us that he got out of the train station and he was not sure which direction to go to get to us. So he said, I found the first person that was walking in front of me, and I called the person to ask for direction, and as soon as the person turned, I knew that I had made a very bad mistake. The person was a walking drunk. But he said, I was shy, and I couldn't just say thank you. I said to the person, would you guide me? And he quotes the address. And the person looks deep into his eyes and says, sir, you first tell me where I am, then I tell you. It's a true story. If you meet him, tell him. He would, of course, give you a great more details. But that's really the truth of it. Now that we know majority of people are walking asleep, the bad term for these zombies, that's really not what I mean. Let's start with history. Most of us had to learn European history. And let's not go too far. Let's start from the Roman time. The Roman Empire, as you see, covered every piece of land around the Mediterranean at one time. Every country was there. And this was one of the most civilized nations of its age. The Romans had law and order. However, they never had justice in the way we understand it today. The Romans would be defined as slaves or free men or women, and each of them had different rights. Also as citizens and non-citizens. If you were Roman, you had very different rights and privileges compared to if you were not a Roman citizen. Education was available, but was only available to the elite and the rich people of his age. Women could study, but only a limited amount and only for the very special elite, the daughters of the elite of the society. Now, power, of course, we are told that absolute power corrupts. And these guys had it, absolute power. So corruption was rampant in that society. And the power was mostly in the hand of landowners and senators that were the members of the elite that ruled the country, and of course the military. At least 20% of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. And slaves, I'm using it in the worst possible way we can imagine who was a slave and what they were up to. Militarism was one of the pride of the Romans. All they needed to know was that there was another country that they didn't rule, and here was the army besieged and started going. And the expense of this militarism was coming from the countries that they were occupying and conquering. So you can imagine what would happen to the fate of the conquered nations. Okay. In that society, that we call it the most civilized society of our time in those days, persecution of the Jews was the norm of the day, as well as the persecution of Christians that turned up around the first century within the Roman Empire. And the persecution of the Christians, of course, continued all the way to around 395, when eventually they achieved power and they became the most powerful, or in fact, the state religion. But interestingly enough, the persecution of the Jews did not stop. The persecution of the Jews continued amongst the European nations all the way until the end of the Second World War. All right, not to mention about the persecution of other people. These people would be thrown in front of lions, their wealth would be taken, and anything that you can imagine like that. The empire had its most expansion around 117, and you can see how vast it was. But within this huge empire, the churches gradually achieved tremendous power. One of the first things that the Christian church did when it achieved power was to call upon an army of Christians going all the way to Libya and totally annihilating another Christian sect in Libya that believed Christ was a prophet, not God. Corruption within that empire was rampant of every form, every leaders, and eventually this society practically imploded from within, destroyed itself to the extent that eventually practically barbarians of Germanic race moved in and conquered the Western Roman Empire. By then, of course, the Roman Empire had moved part of its capital to the east in the form of Byzantine Empire, and Byzantine Empire eventually was destroyed at the hand of the Muslims and the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is what the Roman Empire went through. If you're still with me, I'm trying to take you through the psyche of the Europeans to see what they went through until become who they are today. Then comes the Crusaders, terribly barbarians. The Christian princes were fighting so much amongst themselves that the Pope decided the only way that they can get them to stop fighting each other was to get them to fight somebody else. So the Pope Urban II called them all and said, "Oh, princes, the birthplace of our Lord Jesus Christ is in the hand of the infidels. Let's go and get it." And that started a process that lasted almost 2 centuries. And during these 2 centuries, killing and pillage continued. In fact, the funny thing is that the Christian army will start from Italy, going all the way around, but the first place they would sack would be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Roman Empire, basically a Catholic center. So as you see, there was very little of principle. These people were zombies walking around. All they wanted is murder and killing. Can we imagine human rights in those days? Non-existent, none whatsoever. Plagues practically wiped out half of Europe. That's about their healthcare, if you like. Then you have the unification of Spain. As soon as the Spaniards were united, the first thing they did, they expelled all the Muslims and Jews from Spain in the Andalusia. They gave them a deadline: either you leave or you have to convert. And of course, many of them left. But those that stayed behind, which large in numbers, Muslims and Jews, converted to Christianity. But that wasn't good enough for the church. They had to be tortured to make sure that they were truly Christians. And that brought the period of Spanish Inquisition that you can read about. Now, was there very much freedom of religion? Was there very much human rights amongst the Europeans? We come all the way in time to the War of the Empires. The French, the Spanish, the British wars, and they did all kinds of things they did. They murdered, destroyed part of Europe. Then came the First World War, then came Second World War. And in the Second World War, we have, of course, the presence of German Third Reich. And was there very much religious freedom in Europe? Of course not. In fact, even the churches cooperated, a lot of them, with the Third Reich, although many of the people of conscience did not do. But that's where we're just beginning to see that people are changing. Now, if you look at the wars of these empires with each other, and eventually the First and Second World War, it's amazing to watch. By then, Europe had 17th century of the pure teachings of Christ. So there is no excuse. But these 17 centuries of Christian kingdoms did not solve anything. If you see what these Christians did in collecting slaves and bring them all over the world to sell them, particularly to these lands, millions of them, and millions would die in the process, of course. You can see human rights is not something which was innate either to Christian thought or Christian people of Europe. We may think differently today now that we see them, but this is not the way they were. If they were like that, it would have not taken 4 centuries for this land to get rid of slavery, to get rid of apartheid, to get rid of concepts such as equal but separate. Okay, now think what happened. But in the midst of all of this, people were changing, were learning, and then comes with it the incineration of almost 11 million people, almost 6 million of them Jews, and some Baha'is, by the way, who many of them were of our Jewish ancestry in Europe. Something then triggered in the European consciousness after the Second World War. After the First World War, the League of Nations was formed. Abdul Baha, before that, was walking these shores and reminding people that this is not the way to be. But we didn't listen. First World War, with all of its atrocities, happened. Then the Second World War happened. Only then we had the situation that now we can talk about the achievements of Europeans after 17 centuries of Christian culture. Okay? Now, if you look at it, one of the most great achievements after 17 centuries of believing that human beings are all creation of the same God, we came to sign, prepare, make, and sign the Declaration of Human Rights. For those of you who are aware of this document, I suggest every Baha'i should regard it part of his faith, because every principle of it is inspired by the Baha'i writings. Eleanor Roosevelt, who called the committee, including herself, of 19 people, assembled, put it all together, then reduced the committee to 9 people, and eventually took it to the United Nations to be signed. And if you'd like to know more about that lady and her belief in Baha'u'llah and knowing everything about the faith, you can see. So, every element of the Charter of Human Rights has no precedence in any scriptures in detail. You can find some passages here or there, but nothing consistent. So no wonder, as Baha'is, we have to regard that part of our teaching. Look at everything that Abdul Baha did when he walked in these shores, and trace back everything that the Declaration of Human Rights contains. Then Europeans started setting up democratic institutions, labor unions, civil organization, human rights, social justice, education for all, healthcare for all, separation of church and state in the rest of Europe, which was unique. In America, we had it, but out of absolute necessity. When all these religious refugees landed in these shores, they soon discovered that the only way they can make sure that this land wouldn't become like the motherland that they were all forced to leave is to accept that, to respect belief of everybody else and make sure government has nothing to do with religion. Religion is a personal matter. So Europeans eventually adopted it. After almost 17 centuries of persecuting everybody else of any other faith but Christians, and Christians persecuting each other. If you look at the wars of the Catholics and Protestants, you will know what I'm really talking about. Very good. So then what we had, Europeans and Americans supported the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, which Afrikaans based on the Bible would argue it was perfectly okay to have people separate. Apartheid, that's what it is. Then we had the establishment of European Common Market, and this is something we have lived through ourselves, which eventually ended up as European Union. The American, the Australian, the Canadian soldiers that went to Europe and fought against this evil system of Third Reich returned home. Many of them African Americans who had even a worse condition in America. And then it took the likes of Martin Luther King and a great deal of the raising of the consciousness of Americans to completely try to get rid of the remnants of the effect of slavery and apartheid. So, dear friends, as you see, it took a lot of time, a lot of suffering for all these European zombies, probably ourselves here included, to wake up and realize the fact that humanity comes first and religion is a tool, not the aim, is not the end, is just a tool for creating a better society, better people. That changed America too. That changed Australia too. That changed Canada too. That changed South Africa too, and the rest of the world. So the rest of the world are now watching America, basically the West, and envy the fact that Europeans have changed so much, and now they're talking about human rights, the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the freedom to choose religion or get out of it, the freedom to have your business, place of work, and so on. Not really paying attention to what the Europeans have gone through to get here. Now, I want to take you a little bit through the Persian case. Of course, Persians are very good instantly to remind you that they have a 2,500 years of civilization, and they were the ones who came up with the first Charter of Human Rights, and that's true. But those are on the positive sides. On the behavior side, the Persians have been no different than the savage Europeans. No different, really. The history of Iran, just like Europe, it is a history of war, but of a different type. Iran was a land that every conqueror in the world had to go and visit. Think of the consequences. 2,000 years, every conqueror going and establishing its rule there. From Alexander the Great, which, by the way, the Persians don't call him the Great. They called him Alexander of Macedonia. And as a child, I always thought Macedonia. I always thought this Macedonia is a curse word, because they would say it as though this was a curse word. It was much later I read that all they're saying is that Alexander was from Macedonia. This is nothing about disrespect to the man. Now, the Persian history also is a history of these people having suffered from the consequences of negative aspects of religion, if not more, certainly as much as Europeans. Now, throughout the ages, Iranians in large numbers have been sold to slavery. In large numbers. 1,400 years ago, when the Arab conquered Iran, I do not know how many ladies were left in Iran. The rest were all bundled and sent to the rest of the empire to be sold as slaves. Young boys, young men, just the same way. Everything they had was taken away from them. The historical oppression of the people of Iran continued and continued and continued, every time getting even worse than before. The impact of almost 2,000 years of suffering and punishment had a very deep effect on the psyche of Iranians. And then I'm going to tell you, the miracle is that Baha'u'llah, out of these type of Persians, created a society which is just the opposite of everything you're going to see here. The general psyche of Persians is about this. Generally, they are fearful people. They are distrusting, and they have every right. Anybody who trusted betrayed them. Throughout its history, they are passive acceptance of force. Whenever the force comes, they apply the martial law. They let it come in. They don't fight it. And then later on, when they get the opportunity, they try to destroy it from within. Pretend to assimilation is a very important feature in Persian culture. Pretend to assimilation is basically wherever there is force, they say, oh yes, we are like you. Or we accept it. And they even go beyond what these rulers would ask them to do. As a result of that, they have turned to a nation, you can call them silent observers. We know that everywhere in the world, people, masses of people, are generally silent people. But this is far more exaggerated in the case of the Persian nation. They have enormous pent-up frustration and pent-up anger. And you can see that. If you don't fight them, they do whatever they want to do to you, and also you constantly say, well, thank you for it. What would that do to you? Their willingness, they are unwilling to help a victim because instantly they lose their life in the process, which is understandable. Ruthless tyrants against the weak. In few brief phases in Iranian history, they would look around and find the weakest nation, for example, Indians, and every year a Persian army would march into India, pick up everything that those poor people had, massacre quite a large number of them, and come back. This has happened not once, twice. So terrible tyrants, but against the force, submissive. Conflicted in personal and public life. If you want to genuinely talk to a Persian, by the way, I'm not talking about Baha'is, and I'm going to come back to that. Why? If you want to genuinely talk to a Persian, never talk to two of them at the same time. You would never get what they mean. They don't mean what they say, and don't say what they mean. 2,000 years of history. Europeans had it too, until very recently. All right? Pretends to faith without genuinely believing in it. This is one of those other features. In fact, many European travelers who traveled through Iran in the past 2-3 centuries, they would say that as soon as you get together, they talk about religion. But if you really press hard, you'll find that it's not of a deep-rooted faith. Abundance of religion, religious and cultural prejudices, and most of the intellectuals and educated Iranians also suffered the same behavioral pattern of the masses. For example, you will see that the past 170 years of the suffering of Baha'is of Iran, very rarely, until the past maybe 10, 15 years ago, you will find an Iranian intellectual even writing about it. Or even when they would mention, they will add passages that would make it safe for them to say so, by passages such as, of course they deserved it, or they were the troublemakers, or they were a thorn on the side of the government, and things like that. Now, most Iranians, with some exceptions, could have only operated on a survival mode at the cost of everything else. This is what I want you to see as the cause, not the effect. The cause was that these people were put down so much by forces throughout their histories that they learned all they have to do is to survive, and they would survive one day at a time. Now, large-scale oppression of the people of Iran in the Islamic Republic is a good testimony to that. Pent-up energies, pent-up frustrations of people, as well as a ruthless regime, resulted in forcing 6 million Iranians to leave their land of birth. Over 300 Baha'is were killed at the hands of this regime. And now we're talking about post-Second World War. Supposedly, this nation also has signed the International Charter of Human Rights. Not only that, even their graves have been desecrated. The administrators of the Baha'i community in Iran are still in prison, and they will be, if it is up to them, for decades to come. As Baha'is, because we are non-aggressive, and some of you might have heard my talks on the subject of non-aggression, which is the most unique feature of the Baha'i faith, non-aggression, you will see that as soon as this regime came to power, the Baha'is obeyed them and totally dissolved their institutions. Local spiritual assembly, national assembly, all its functions. But it's a community of almost 500,000 people, maybe more. And they needed to be organized and helped to do their daily chores. So with the approval of government, we appointed individuals that in different regions basically acted as counselors. And as soon as that particular government changed, the next government said, no, we don't agree, and these guys ended up in prison, and they are incredible individuals. Baha'i staff of governmental offices and related businesses have all been thrown out. Schools of higher education have been closed to the Baha'is. Their businesses have been closed. And Baha'is, despite all of that, have done something incredible, which is totally un-Iranian in terms of national character. And this is the miracle of Baha'u'llah. From the Jews who have been suffering almost for 2,500 years, if we don't say more, at the hands of oppressors all over the world, came to the Baha'i faith. The Zoroastrians for 1,400 years have suffered and forcibly converted to Islam, and those that there were remnants of them came to the Baha'i faith. Very little of them left. And the Shia themselves, who suffered almost for 1,000 years before a Shia government was established in Iran almost 500 years ago, came the rest of the Baha'is. And this society does not have any of the characteristics that I described to you. All they have to say one word, I'm not a Baha'i, I'm a Muslim. Their job would be given to them. They will be brought down from the gallows. Their children could go to school. Their businesses would be open to them. Just one word, I'm not a Baha'i. Once I was on a live radio interview, and people would call. This was in Toronto. And one wonderful Muslim lady called and said, Dr. Bayat, you believe in Islam, don't you? I said, yes, of course I do. He said, well, then as you see, Islam is not such a bad religion. Why don't Baha'is say that they are Muslims so that they wouldn't be killed? And I laughed and laughed, and I just didn't know what to say. Well, if it is not such a bad thing, then why do they kill people for not admitting that they are not? Anyway, these Baha'is have put up with sufferings and have absolutely stayed on the path of non-aggression. They haven't even raised their arms. In these TV programs that I'm part of it, our Jewish friend, very wonderful friend, very wonderful guy, deep individual, turned around and said, well, you know, I disagree with this Baha'i approach. Why don't you do something about it? Why don't you rise up? Isn't enough of you been killed, thrown out of the country, so on and so on? All I had to do is to remind him of when the Jews decided to fight the Romans in 70 AD and 130 AD, which resulted in 2,000 years of Jews being turned to wanderers around the world. And he immediately admitted, force is not the way to go. Very good. Higher education, I've already talked to you. When Baha'is were thrown out of universities, we set up our own university, online. All the professors are in prison right now. However, as a result of what Baha'is did, the suffering, but in the meantime, they kept talking. Every report from the United Nations talks about Baha'is. Every channel of radio and television you pick up nowadays, people talk about the Baha'i faith, its teachings, and what the Baha'is have done and what they are putting up with. To the extent that suddenly, one by one, the slumber that I said is universal for everyone, and as I said was common amongst the Europeans and the rest of the world, have started to change. We are now beginning to see signs of this. Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi defended the Baha'is in Iran and ended up escaping the country because they wanted to kill him. Abdul Fattah Soltani, the second one, defended a lot of Baha'is, and the poor guy is in prison right now, suffering from physical and ill health. Nasrin Sotoudeh, another wonderful lady lawyer, defended the Baha'is and others. And in the process, she is, apart from some prison term that she passed, she's now banned from practicing law for 3 years. But every day she's in front of the Association of the Lawyers saying, I have rights. These changes that started as trickles, just like small flowers here and there, which looking at them, we would have not seen the spring, have now started getting much bigger. You may see that the movie that Mahmal Baf created called The Baghaban, The Gardener. If you haven't seen it, please see it. This man was one of the most significant agents of that government, making films for the Islamic Revolution. He would go to Haifa and make a film about the Baha'i faith. It's actually a dialogue about the Baha'i faith. And of course, in the process, he lost all of the prizes over the past 3 decades he had won in Iran. In the museum they created for his work is all now closed down. So he's a person non grata in that place. The next one is to light a candle. You probably have seen the movie. That's another one comes. And the creator of that movie is in deep trouble in Iran now. You probably see this program, Yaran program. I've been 4 years on this every week for 2 hours broadcasting to almost 300 million Persian-speaking people in the world. The effect of this program, more than anything else, have awakened the consciousness of the Iranians. Those of you who have family or relatives in Iran, or you have those that visit you, ask them only one question. How are the people of Iran are changing? Don't talk about government. That is not going to change. As the Third Reich did not change. None of those things change, but people are changing. If after the Second World War, Europe became what it is and America became what it is in Western Europe and North America, is as a result of the consequences and the consequences of the consciousness of the people of the West saying that no more Holocaust, no more war, no more persecution of minorities. Anybody who's a refugee anywhere in the world, where does it find its way eventually? And these nations are accepting them because they had more than 2,000 years of it, suffering of it themselves. You can see every one of them. Mohammad Nourizad was one of the brightest stars of the Iranian regime. Filmmaker for them, intellectual. Every day now, he's protesting against the abuse of power and the fact that Baha'is are under pressure in Iran. You can see his picture. Went to the house of a Baha'i, young Baha'i, whose father, mother, and are in prison, and the grandfather has been killed. Kisses the feet of this tiny little boy called Artin, and puts it on his website, and every day he walks in the country and talks about that. Mohammad Nourizad is doing the same thing, and you know other characters. The last film that came up is, it's not a film, it's a documentary. This is being prepared. It's an archive of what the Baha'is of Iran are going through. Actually, 2 of it has been being created in the world at university levels. One of them is called the Quiet Genocide, and so on. Now, these, I take them to be signs of the spring coming. There are hundreds of Iranian intellectuals, professors, human rights activists, students. All of them are doing what they do at the expense of their own lives and their own livelihood. And this is unique in Persian history. Every one of those pictures that I saw you, none of them can return back to Iran. And they all are lovers of Iran. These students in thousands are doing that. During the last election, I saw some posters of it. The students in university, I wouldn't tell you which one, would constantly have a poster of me, Dr. Bayat for the Minister of Oil. Of course, they don't know I wouldn't accept such a position anyway. But you see what is going on? 10 years ago, this would have been impossible. 20 years ago, don't even talk about it. If an intellectual Iranians want to talk about the faith, we say, well, I'm very sorry, sir, you've suffered, but of course, you know, there is a reason for it. And you say, well, what is the reason? He would say, well, you know, it's a very systematic country and you're destroying its foundation. And we'll come up with all reasons. By the way, all of it is true. In the history of human race, there has never been a more revolutionary idea that's a set of the teachings of the Baha'i faith. A country that still prides itself to covering up women, coming with the idea that women should be free to wear whatever they want, in a government that is ruled by a clergy, the Baha'is coming and talking about the separation of church and state, and I'm looking around, okay, I still have 20 minutes. Is that correct? Wow, this is good. No, I'm told that's not right. Okay. In a country that is based on Sharia, to come and say the Sharia is abrogated, a country that goes around the world and gives them weapon and money to go and fight and kill, you say the holy war is over. Everything about the Baha'i faith is revolutionary. Now, here are the great surprises. Religious leaders, one after the other, have started supporting the faith. For those of you who are following it up in the news. So soon we will have more of these telling them what to do. So the spring is full with us. Iranian intellectuals, teachers, historians, poets, artists, filmmakers, writers, all of them, we have names, hundreds of them, have parted with their past prejudiced views and campaign for the full citizenship of the rights of the Baha'is. And this is done as a consequence of non-aggressive approach of the Baha'is, their suffering, their martyrdom, their willingness to do whatever it takes and stay true and truthful to what Baha'u'llah wants them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Of course, this was for the people of Iran who are suffering there. Thank you.